The year is 1200. The world is a patchwork of ancient empires and rising powers, but a storm is gathering that will change the course of history forever. At the center of the world was Baghdad, the city of scholars, the jewel of the Abbasid Caliphate, and the light of human knowledge. Here, science, medicine, and philosophy flourished. It was an era of unparalleled learning, protected by centuries of tradition. But from the east, an unstoppable force was moving. The Mongols, led by the descendants of Genghis Khan, were carving a path of destruction across the map. In 1258, the world shifted. Baghdad fell. The Mongol hordes under Hulagu Khan showed no mercy to the center of civilization. The great libraries were put to the torch. Knowledge gathered over 5 centuries was erased in a matter of days. Legend says the Tigris ran black with the ink of books and red with the blood of scholars. The Islamic Golden Age had come to a violent end. The fall of Baghdad left a void in the heart of the world. The old structures were gone, leaving only chaos and uncertainty in their wake. In Anatolia, the once mighty Seljuk Sultanate was shattering into dozens of small, warring beyliks, each fighting for survival against the Mongol pressure. To the west, the Byzantine Empire was a hollow shell, clinging to the walls of Constantinople, its lands slowly shrinking as the world closed in. It was an age of chaos, an age where the old world was dying and nothing had yet risen to take its place. But in the farthest corners of northwestern Anatolia, a small tribe of refugees was quietly planting the seeds of a new destiny. Far from the Mongol heartland, near the Byzantine border, a small frontier settlement began to take root. This was the Kayu tribe, a people who had lost everything in the east, seeking only a place to call home. Among them was a leader with a vision that extended beyond the borders of his small camp, a man who understood the system of the world. His name was Osman, and the world was about to learn that, from the ruins of one era, a giant was being born. The stage was set. The vacuum of power was about to be filled by a name that would endure for 600 years. This was Söğüt, a humble frontier settlement on the edge of the Byzantine world. Here, Osman, the son of Ertuğrul, began his journey. Osman was a man of the frontier. He didn't just lead Turks, he called to all who were tired of the old ways, offering a new kind of justice. On the frontier, the lines between faith and ethnicity blurred. Many local Christians joined Osman, becoming his Alps and his closest allies. Marriage was as powerful as the sword. Through alliances with the local Ahi brotherhood and noble families, Osman wove a social fabric that could support an empire. One by one, the small Byzantine towns fell. Not through mass destruction, but through strategic sieges and local diplomacy. The fall of Baghdad left a void in the heart of the world. The old structures were gone, leaving only chaos and uncertainty in their wake. The map began to change. What was once a tribal camp was now a growing state, carving its name into the history of Anatolia. His ultimate goal was Bursa, the gateway to the west. The siege lasted 10 years, a test of patience and endurance that defined the early Ottoman spirit. In 1326, Bursa finally fell. It became the first grand capital of the Ottomans, a symbol of their permanence and their future. But in the farthest corners of northwestern Anatolia, a small tribe of refugees was quietly planting the seeds of a new destiny. In 1354, the impossible happened. The Ottomans crossed into Europe, capturing Gallipoli. The gates of the Balkans were now wide open. The empire was no longer confined to Asia. It was becoming a power of 2 worlds, its reach extending into the heart of Europe. The expansion was relentless. Driven by a system that integrated the conquered, the Ottoman territory grew into a vast mosaic of cultures and lands. The stage was set. The vacuum of power was about to be filled by a name that would endure for 600 years. From a single seed in Söğüt, a world-shaping giant was born. This is the story of the man who started it all. Join us as we explore the further chapters of this monumental history. As the Ottoman borders expanded, the sultans realized they needed more than a tribal army. They needed a force loyal only to the throne. They needed the Janissaries. Through the Devshirme system, the smartest and strongest Christian boys were selected from across the Balkans. It was a tax of blood that would build the brain and muscle of an empire. The separation was final. These boys were taken to the capital, converted, and raised as the Sultan's personal slaves, a brotherhood with no family but the core. Their training was brutal and absolute. Years of discipline turned boys into the most feared warriors of the age. masters of the bow, the sword, and the early firearm. In an era of chaotic feudal levies, the Janissaries offered something new: professional, permanent discipline. They were the world's first standing army since the fall of Rome. At the Battle of Kosovo, the Janissaries proved their worth. They stood their ground while others fled, breaking the power of the Balkan kingdoms and securing Ottoman dominance in Europe. But just as the empire seemed unstoppable, a shadow emerged from the east that would bring it to the very brink of total annihilation. Timur, the legendary conqueror of the east, marched west. His horsemen were a whirlwind of destruction, targeting the heart of the Ottoman realm. In 1402, at the Battle of Ankara, the Ottoman army was shattered. For the first and only time, a sultan was taken prisoner. The empire was left leaderless and broken. The interregnum followed, a decade of civil war. 4 brothers fought for the pieces of their father's dream, while the world watched the empire slowly bleed to death. It was Mehmed I who finally emerged from the ashes. Through sheer will and the loyalty of the remaining Janissaries, he reunified the fractured state. The empire had survived its greatest test. It was smaller, leaner, but more unified than ever before. The engine of expansion was being rebuilt. And as the smoke cleared, the Ottomans turned their eyes toward the ultimate prize, the city that had haunted their dreams since the beginning. Conquering the city was only the beginning. Mehmed II knew that to build a lasting empire, he needed more than a sword. Il needed a system. Constantinople became Istanbul, the crossroads of the world. It was no longer just the capital of a kingdom, but the heart of a global superpower. The Sultan invited the world back into the city. He sought the skills of Greeks, Armenians, and Jews to rebuild the economy. This wasn't just tolerance. It was a strategic integration of different peoples into the very fabric of the state. To manage this diversity, the Ottomans developed the millet system. Each religious community was given the right to govern its own internal affairs. Faiths were organized into autonomous communities, allowed to maintain their own laws, schools, and traditions. Mosques, churches, and synagogues stood side by side, a testament to a level of pluralism rarely seen in the 15th century world. In 1492, as the Spanish Inquisition forced thousands of Jews to flee, Sultan Bayezid II saw an opportunity where others saw an enemy. He sent the Ottoman navy to rescue the Sephardic Jews of Spain, inviting them to settle across the empire. They brought with them new technologies, medical knowledge, and deep trade connections that fueled the empire's growth. By controlling the major trade routes between East and West, the Ottomans became the gatekeepers of the world's wealth. The Silk Road and the spice routes all flowed through Ottoman ports, making the Sultan the richest man on earth. Goods from 3 continents filled the warehouses of the Golden Horn, financing the empire's grand ambitions. But wealth needed protection. In 1517, Selim the Grim marched south, fundamentally shifting the balance of power in the Islamic world. With the conquest of Egypt, the Ottomans seized control of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, assuming the mantle of the Caliphate. The empire now controlled the Red Sea and the eastern Mediterranean, effectively locking down the region. For the first time in centuries, a single power provided stability from the Balkans to the Persian Gulf, a period known as the Pax Ottomana. Sophisticated bureaucracy and a meritocratic system allowed the empire to govern millions of people with remarkable efficiency. At its peak, it was a superpower without equal, stretching its influence from the gates of Vienna to the shores of the Indian Ocean. The Ottoman Empire wasn't just built on conquest. It was built on a system that embraced the world. That was the secret to its 600-year reign. In 1520, a young man ascended the throne who would become known to the world as Suleiman the Magnificent. His reign would be the empire's longest and its most glorious. Under his rule, the Ottoman Empire reached the zenith of its political, military, and economic power. He was the lawgiver, the Sultan of Sultans. His military genius was unmatched. In just 2 hours at the Battle of Mohacs, he crushed the Hungarian army, opening the gates of Europe. He marched to the very gates of Vienna. Though the city held, the world knew that Suleiman's shadow now loomed over the heart of Christendom. On the seas, his admiral Hayreddin Barbarossa turned the Mediterranean into an Ottoman lake, defeating every European navy that dared to challenge them. But Suleiman was more than a conqueror. He was a poet, a scholar, and a visionary builder who reshaped the landscape of his empire. He commissioned Mimar Sinan to build the Suleymaniye Mosque, a masterpiece of stone and light that remains a symbol of his enduring legacy. Writing under the pen name Muhibi, his verses spoke of love, longing, and the heavy burden of the crown. Behind the scenes, the empire was changing. His love for Hurrem Sultan broke centuries of tradition, as she became his legal wife and a powerful political advisor. But the Golden Age was not without its shadows. As Suleiman aged, the very system he built began to turn against his own blood. The execution of his eldest son, Prince Mustafa, on charges of treason remains one of the greatest tragedies in Ottoman history. It was a choice that would haunt the Sultan's final years. He died in his tent during his final campaign in Hungary, leaving behind an empire at its peak, but a family shattered by the pursuit of the throne. Suleiman the Magnificent was the greatest of the Ottomans. His reign was a golden era of law, art, and conquest, a bridge between two worlds that changed history forever. The golden age of Suleiman could not last forever. By the late 16th century, the pillars of Ottoman power were beginning to crack from within. The Janissaries, once the Sultan's most loyal protectors, became his greatest threat. Overturning their soup kettles was a signal that the city was no longer safe. Palace coups became common. Sultans were made and broken by the whims of the military and the harem, leading to a century of political paralysis. While Istanbul struggled with internal strife, the world was moving around it. European explorers had found new paths to the riches of the East. Vasco da Gama and the explorers of the Atlantic had broken the Ottoman monopoly on the spice trade, draining the empire's coffers. New World silver flooded the Mediterranean, triggering an economic crisis. The Ottoman currency lost its value, and with it, the empire's stability. By the late 18th century, Sultan Selim III realized the empire had to modernize or die. He introduced the Nizami Jadid, the new order. He sought to build a modern army, but the old guard would not yield. His reforms were met with blood and fire. Selim's vision ended in his deposition and murder. For a time, it seemed the fracture was permanent. In 1826, Mahmud II finally took the decisive step. He provoked the Janissaries into one last revolt, and he was ready. Known as the Auspicious Incident, the Sultan's cannons tore through the heart of the Janissary corps, ending their centuries-long reign of terror. The old order was burned away in a single day, but the damage to the empire's foundation had been deep and lasting. The fracture was halted, but the empire was no longer the giant it once was. On the periphery, the edges were already starting to fall away. The century of decay had left the sick man of Europe struggling to hold onto a world that was rapidly changing. The 19th century brought a new and unstoppable force to the Ottoman borders: nationalism. For an empire built on diversity, it would prove to be a fatal poison. It began in Greece. In 1821, the first major brick was pulled from the wall. The dream of independent nation-states began to tear the imperial fabric apart. One by one, the Balkan states followed. Centuries of Ottoman rule vanished in a wave of revolts, leaving behind a trail of blood and displacement. To the outside world, the empire was now the sick man of Europe. Its fate was no longer in its own hands, but in the meeting rooms of its rivals. In London, Paris, and St. Petersburg, the great powers plotted the partition of the empire, waiting like vultures for the final collapse. Every attempt at reform was met with external pressure and internal resistance. The empire was trapped in a downward spiral. In 1914, the empire made its final fatal gamble. It entered the First World War, hoping to reclaim its lost glory. Instead, it found only ruin. Millions were mobilized for a war the empire could not afford. Men from every corner of the realm were sent to fronts they would never return from. From the sands of Gaza to the mountains of the Caucasus, Ottoman troops fought with desperate bravery in the most brutal conditions of the Great War. At Gallipoli, the empire stood its ground in a legendary defense. But the victory came at a staggering cost: the loss of an entire generation. The hills of the peninsula became a vast graveyard, a testament to the sacrifice of those who fought for a dying cause. Amidst the chaos of the war, the most tragic chapter of all unfolded within the empire's own borders, a tragedy that still haunts history. The deportation of the Armenian population into the Syrian desert led to unimaginable suffering and death, a wound in the heart of the empire that would never heal. Famine and disease ravaged the home front. The people were exhausted, their spirit broken by years of relentless conflict and internal disintegration. By 1918, the Ottoman Empire was a ghost. Its armies were defeated, its lands occupied, and its ancient throne was teetering on the edge of the abyss. Allied fleets anchored in the Golden Horn. The capital of the Caesars and the Caliphs was no longer Ottoman. The end had finally arrived. The map was redrawn, the borders vanished, and 600 years of imperial history came to a somber, tragic close. The empire was gone. But from its ashes, a new struggle for survival was about to begin. 1453, a year that changed the world forever. The legendary walls of Constantinople, which had stood for a millennium, were about to face their ultimate test. At just 21 years old, Sultan Mehmed II was obsessed. His goal? To conquer the city of the world's desire and cement his place in history. He knew that to take the city, he had to cut it off. Every detail of the siege was meticulously planned. In just 4 months, he built the Rumeli Hisara, the throat cutter, tightening the noose around the Byzantine capital. But walls this strong required something unprecedented. Mehmed turned to a master foundryman to create the largest cannon the world had ever seen. The Great Bombard, a beast of bronze, capable of hurling a 600-pound stone ball over a mile. Inside the city, Emperor Constantine V watched the gathering storm. He knew the odds were against him, but he refused to surrender. The city's 7,000 defenders prepared for the arrival of an army 10 times their size. April 1453. The siege began. At night, the Ottoman campfires glowed like a sea of stars, a terrifying sight for those on the walls. Then, the silence of the dawn was shattered. The great guns opened fire, and the ground itself began to shake. The walls of Theodosius, which had survived earthquakes and previous sieges, were finally beginning to crumble. Day after day, the bombardment continued. The age of gunpowder had truly arrived, but the Golden Horn remained closed by a massive iron chain protecting the city's northern flank. Mehmed did the impossible. He ordered his fleet to be dragged over land, bypassing the chain. By dawn, the Byzantine defenders woke to find the Ottoman navy right at their back door. After 53 days of siege, Mehmed prepared for the final assault. He gave his men 1 day of rest and prayer. The night of May 28th was quiet. Both sides knew that tomorrow would decide the fate of an empire. At 1:30 a.m., the attack began. Wave after wave of Ottoman troops threw themselves at the gaps in the walls. Finally, Mehmed sent in his best, the Janissaries. They were the final hammer blow. The fighting was brutal. The emperor himself was seen in the thick of it, defending the breach with his life. Constantine V died as he lived, as a Roman emperor. His body was never found. The walls had been breached. The city that had stood for 1,123 years as the capital of Rome had fallen. Mehmed II entered the city not just as a conqueror, but as the Kaiser-i-Rum, the Caesar of Rome. His first destination was the heart of the city, the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia. He was struck by its beauty. He immediately ordered it to be preserved and converted into a mosque. With the fall of Constantinople, the Middle Ages came to a close. The Renaissance was about to begin. The fall of the city sent shockwaves through Europe, forcing explorers like Columbus to find new routes to the east. Constantinople became Istanbul, the vibrant heart of the Ottoman Empire for centuries to come. But the echoes of 1453 still resonate, a reminder of the shifting tides of history and the fall of giants. The fall of Constantinople wasn't just the end of a city, it was the birth of a new era. 1918. The Ottoman Empire was occupied. For the people of Istanbul, the presence of foreign warships was the ultimate humiliation. But in the heart of Anatolia, a new fire was being lit. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk refused to accept the death of his nation. What followed was a desperate war for survival, a struggle not for an empire, but for a homeland. The War of Independence was the crucible. It was here that the identity of the modern Turk was forged in the heat of battle. At Sakarya and the Great Offensive, the tides turned. The invaders were pushed back, and the dream of independence became a reality. In 1923, the Treaty of Lausanne recognized the sovereignty of the new Turkish state. The world finally acknowledged its right to exist. The Sultanate was abolished. The House of Osman, which had ruled for 6 centuries, was no more. On October 29, 1923, the Republic was proclaimed. A new sun was rising over Anatolia. The era of the Republic had begun. Atatürk knew that independence was only the first step. He launched a series of radical reforms to modernize every aspect of Turkish life. The old script gave way to the new, opening the doors of education and literacy to the entire nation. Turkey became one of the first nations in the world to grant women the right to vote and hold office, a fundamental pillar of the new republic. From secularism to modern law, the republic was built on the values of the Enlightenment, bridging the gap between East and West. As the old imperial flag was lowered, it marked the end of a 1,000-year journey from the steppes of Asia. And as the flag of the Republic rose, it carried the hopes and dreams of a new nation into the modern age. Atatürk's legacy remains the bedrock of Turkey, a guiding light for a people who chose their own destiny. The story of the Ottomans is a story of us all, of power, of tragedy, and ultimately of transformation. Join us as we look toward the future, carrying the lessons of the past with us.